September 18, 1944. Arnhem, the Netherlands. The bridge over the lower Rhine stood intact against a pale sky, its steel arches rising in calm indifference above a city already tearing itself apart. Smoke drifted between brick facades. Shattered glass glittered across cobbled streets. Somewhere beyond the riverbank, artillery rolled like distant thunder, slow and methodical, shaking dust from ceilings and nerves from men. Operation Market Garden had begun less than 24 hours earlier with confidence bordering on certainty. Allied planners believed the war could be shortened by a single audacious stroke. Seize a chain of bridges through the Netherlands, open a corridor into Germany, cross the Rhine, and collapse the Reich before Christmas. Paratroopers from the British 1st Airborne Division had dropped west of Arnhem the previous afternoon, drifting down beneath silk canopies into fields already mapped in briefings as manageable objectives. They had expected light resistance, scattered units retreating eastward. Instead, they found armored SS formations refitting in the very area they were meant to secure. The air had filled with tracer fire before some men even touched ground. Radios failed. Units scattered. Columns meant to reach the bridge within hours found themselves stalled in streets clogged with wreckage and German counterattacks. By nightfall, only a fraction of Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's 2nd Battalion had fought its way onto the northern end of the Arnhem Bridge. They dug in inside Dutch houses, machine guns propped against shattered windows, ammunition stacked on kitchen tables where families had eaten breakfast only days before. Reinforcements failed to break through. By morning, the men at the bridge understood they were alone. Among them was a British sniper, Corporal Alan Reeves of the 1st Airborne Reconnaissance Squadron, a thin man from Dorset whose patience had been forged not in glory but in quiet hours lying still, learning how to let his pulse slow until the rifle barrel steadied as naturally as breath. Reeves did not speak often. He had jumped into Sicily and Italy before this and carried with him a sense that bold plans rarely survived contact with the ground. That morning he chose a position on the upper floor of a brick house overlooking the southern approach to the bridge. He cleared a firing slit between curtains, adjusted sandbags beneath his Lee Enfield, and began counting the rhythm of German movement below. He did not fire at the first men he saw. Snipers learned early that discipline was survival. He waited for officers, radio carriers, machine gun teams, men whose loss created silence rather than noise. As German armored vehicles probed toward the bridge, Reeves tracked the hatches, memorizing the silhouettes. When the first SS officer stepped into view gesturing his men forward, Reeves exhaled and squeezed. The shot cracked above the roar of engines. The officer folded mid-stride. Confusion rippled through the column. It would be the first of dozens of carefully chosen interruptions in the hours ahead. Meanwhile, on the bridge deck itself, 2 American combat engineers found themselves in a place no American unit had been intended to hold. Staff Sergeant Thomas "Tom" McCrae from Ohio and Technician 5th Grade Luis Herrera from New Mexico had been attached to a British airborne liaison detail as demolition specialists. Men whose role was not to capture but to destroy if necessary. Their training was methodical. Calculate charges, cut wires, withdraw before detonation. But Arnhem had rewritten every plan. The bridge had to remain intact for Allied armor to advance. Demolition was no longer the mission. Holding was. McCrae and Herrera had crossed paths with Frost's men during the scramble to the northern ramp and, lacking orders to the contrary, stayed. Engineers were trained to think structurally. They saw not just the width of the roadway but its choke points, the iron ribs beneath, the places where rubble could be shaped into barricades. By mid-morning they were hauling overturned trams and sandbags into defensive arcs alongside British paratroopers who had never expected American voices in their line. The accents mingled oddly in the smoke. Ammunition was redistributed without regard to nationality. German fire intensified. Mortar rounds bracketed the bridge. Armored cars tested the approaches, retreating under anti-tank fire from British PIAT teams firing from upstairs windows. Inside one shattered storefront near the bridge entrance, McCrae and Herrera rigged tripwires connected to grenades across stairwells and doorframes, turning civilian architecture into a trap. When a German assault group pushed into the building just before noon, the first blast shook plaster from the ceiling and sent 2 attackers tumbling backward into the street. The second grenade detonated seconds later. Herrera leaned out and fired his M1 carbine down the stairwell as McCrae hurled another grenade, buying time for British paratroopers to reposition above them. Outside, Reeves adjusted his scope to the rooftop opposite and dropped a machine gunner who had begun laying enfilade fire along the bridge deck. Smoke thickened. Flames licked from upper floors where shell impacts had set curtains ablaze. The defenders' perimeter shrank incrementally. Each house lost tightening the circle around the bridgehead. German loudspeakers began broadcasting surrender demands in accented English, promising medical treatment and humane captivity. The message carried across the river, echoing under steel girders. No one replied. Reeves simply shifted his position to avoid countersniper triangulation. McCrae checked the remaining grenades in his pouch. Herrera wiped soot from his eyes and nodded once toward the bridge span where British troopers crouched behind burned-out vehicles. None of them yet knew how long they would be expected to endure. They only understood that the bridge remained theirs for the moment, and that somewhere beyond the horizon Allied armor was meant to be racing north to relieve them. The gap between intention and reality stretched invisibly over the river like a second, more fragile bridge. And in that widening gap, 3 men, 1 British sniper and 2 American engineers, prepared to hold until there was nothing left to hold with. By early afternoon, the soundscape of Arnhem had changed from sporadic engagement to sustained assault. German commanders, now fully aware that a British battalion had seized the northern end of the bridge, shifted from probing attacks to deliberate containment. Armored half-tracks rolled into side streets. Self-propelled guns found firing lanes. Mortars walked their explosions methodically across rooftops, collapsing defensive positions house by house. The defenders could feel the pattern. First suppression, then infantry infiltration, then close-quarters clearing. Reeves recognized it from Sicily. He adjusted not only for distance but for anticipation, studying the pauses between salvos, the moments when German infantry would believe the upper floors neutralized. When the shelling lifted, he was already repositioned to a secondary window he had prepared hours earlier, sandbags dragged by inches across splintered floorboards. Through drifting smoke, he saw SS grenadiers fanning out beneath the bridge arches, attempting to flank the defenders along the riverbank. He chose his shots not for spectacle but for effect, radiomen first, then NCOs whose gestures coordinated movement. Each crack of the Lien field was followed by sudden disorganization below. German soldiers dragged fallen comrades into doorways, unsure from where the fire originated. Counter-snipers searched upper stories blindly. Reeves never remained in one place long enough to be bracketed. When return fire shredded the brick beside his cheek, he did not flinch. He simply slid backward on his elbows and descended one staircase to re-emerge from a different aperture. Precision over volume. Patience over fury. Meanwhile, on the bridge deck, McCrae and Herrera confronted a more brutal geometry. The Germans had brought forward an armored car whose machine guns swept the roadway with disciplined arcs, chewing into sandbags and splintering wood. British PT teams attempted to knock it out, but range and angle conspired against them. McCrae, calculating instinctively, realized the vehicle's gun depression left a narrow blind zone directly beneath the bridge's steel supports. He and Herrera crawled through smoke and debris, hugging the girders while rounds snapped overhead. The heat of burning fuel radiated through their uniforms. Herrera carried 2 remaining gammon bombs, improvised explosive charges favored by airborne troops, while McCrae provided covering fire in short, controlled bursts. They waited for the armored car to pivot its turret toward another threat, then sprinted the final yards into the shadow of its hull. Herrera slammed a charge against the rear plating, yanked the tape tight, and they both dove behind a concrete abutment. The explosion was not cinematic. It was abrupt and concussive, a flat blast that echoed under the bridge and sent smoke pouring from the vehicle's rear hatch. Flames licked upward. German crewmen bailed out in confusion, 2 cut down instantly by British rifle fire from the houses. The roadway fell momentarily silent except for the hiss of burning fuel. But the victory carried a cost. Shrapnel from the detonation sliced into Herrera's left forearm, drawing blood that soaked into his sleeve. He wrapped it tightly with gauze without ceremony. There was no medic to spare for minor wounds. Inside the nearest building, British paratroopers were down to a handful of magazines per man. Ammunition crates had been carried during the drop, not resupplied. The promised link-up with XXX Corps, the British armored column advancing north, remained stalled miles away by German resistance along a single narrow highway. Radio operators at the bridge transmitted increasingly strained messages requesting reinforcement, their signals fading in and out amid interference. By late afternoon, German artillery escalated to heavier calibers. One shell struck the corner of the house Reeves occupied, collapsing half the facade and burying him in dust. For several seconds the world reduced to ringing silence and choking plaster. He clawed free, coughing, and retrieved his rifle from beneath shattered beams. The building was no longer defensible. He crossed under fire to another position closer to the river, pausing only long enough to fire at a German flamethrower team attempting to advance along the quay. The first man dropped. The second retreated, dragging the tank behind him. On the bridge, McCrae and Herrera shifted from maneuver to endurance. German infantry pressed again, this time under smoke cover. Grenades arced through windows. One detonated near the stairwell where Herrera had earlier set tripwires, wounding 2 British troopers and igniting curtains already brittle from heat. The interior filled with thick black smoke that blurred lines between floors. McCrae ordered a fallback to the next room while Herrera, despite his bleeding arm, pulled a wounded paratrooper by the webbing straps toward relative cover. Outside, German loudspeakers resumed their surrender appeals, now layered with recorded sounds of tanks to exaggerate perceived strength. The psychological weight bore down on men who had not slept since the drop. Yet none moved toward the white flag. Reeves, now positioned near the riverbank rubble, watched as German engineers attempted to bring forward demolition charges of their own, perhaps intending to destroy the bridge if they could not retake it intact. He fired twice in quick succession, disrupting the team long enough for British riflemen to engage. The charges were abandoned in the street. Dusk approached slowly, staining the sky over the Rhine a dull copper. Smoke thickened into a low ceiling. Fires burned unchecked in upper stories, casting flickering shadows across the bridge girders. Ammunition was counted in individual rounds. McCrae inventoried their grenades, 4 between them. Herrera's arm trembled slightly from blood loss, though he concealed it. Reeves cleaned grit from his bolt action with methodical care, as though routine alone could impose order on chaos. Across the river, German forces regrouped for night assault. The defenders understood the pattern well enough by now. Night would not bring relief. It would bring infiltration, close-quarters clearing, and perhaps the final attempt to overrun the bridgehead. Yet even as exhaustion set into bone and sinew, the 3 men, and the shrinking circle of British paratroopers around them, remained fixed to their task. They were no longer holding timetables or strategies. They were holding because retreat would fracture the line entirely. Because the bridge, if lost, would not merely represent a failed operation but a collapse of everything that had been promised when parachutes opened above Dutch fields. As darkness settled, Reeves chambered another round. McCrae checked the pins on his last grenades. Herrera tightened the bandage on his arm. Somewhere to the south, the rumble of distant armor suggested movement, but distance can deceive as cruelly as hope. And in the deepening night over Arnhem, the bridge remained a contested spine of steel, defended now not by plan but by resolve. Night at Arnhem did not arrive quietly. It fell like a lid. Smoke settled low over the river and mixed with river mist, turning the bridge into a silhouette suspended in gray. Fires burned unchecked in the upper floors of shattered houses, their light flickering against the steel lattice of the span. The defenders had lost their sense of the wider battle. They no longer knew how many German units surrounded them, how far British armor had advanced, or whether relief was hours away or days. What they did know was that the pattern of the assault had changed again. German forces were no longer probing openly. They were infiltrating, moving in small teams, sliding through alleys and cellars, using darkness as concealment rather than noise as intimidation. Reeves recognized it first in the silence between explosions. The The shelling tapered off not because the enemy was exhausted, but because they were shifting tactics. He lay prone in the rubble of a collapsed warehouse near the riverbank, rifle braced against a beam blackened by fire. Through his scope, its glass cracked but still usable, he could see shapes moving across the quay. Not a charge. Asleep, figures hugging shadows, testing doorways. He waited, counting breaths. When one paused to signal the others forward, Reeves fired. The man dropped without a cry. The remaining figures melted backward into darkness. There would be more. There were always more. Inside the bridgehead buildings, McCrae and Herrera had moved their remaining men into interior rooms to avoid silhouetting themselves against windows. Ammunition was rationed with near-clinical discipline. No bursts longer than 3 seconds. No grenade thrown without visual confirmation. The smell inside the house was a layered thing. Burnt plaster, cordite, blood, wet wool. The wounded lay along one wall, some whispering, some silent. A British corporal with a shattered leg gripped a rosary so tightly the beads left impressions in his palm. McCrae knelt beside him briefly, not to promise rescue. He would not lie, but to promise they would not abandon him. Then he returned to the doorway, where Herrera was reinforcing a makeshift barricade with a fallen cabinet and sandbags torn open to create thicker mounds. The German attack came at 22:17 by McCrae's watch, though watches meant little now. It began with a single flare rising over the river, bathing the bridge in harsh white light. In that illumination, German infantry surged forward in coordinated sections, some firing from the hip, others advancing with grenades held low against their chests. The defenders answered immediately. Reeves shifted targets fluidly, prioritizing machine gunners attempting to set up along the embankment. Each shot bought seconds. On the bridge deck, British riflemen and the 2 American engineers fired in controlled arcs, bullets sparking against steel as rounds ricocheted wildly in confined space. A German squad managed to reach the lower arch supports before a grenade from Herrera detonated among them, the blast echoing like a hammer strike beneath the span. Smoke swallowed everything. Screams mingled with the metallic clang of falling weapons. Then the Germans pressed closer, too close for rifles to dominate. It devolved into room-clearing combat inside the buildings adjacent to the bridge. Flashlights cut through darkness. Bayonets flashed in stairwells. One German soldier burst through a side door, only to be struck down by McCrae's Sten gun at less than 5 feet. The recoil jarred his shoulder. He did not register the pain. Herrera, arms still bound tight, dragged a wounded paratrooper behind cover before seizing the fallen German's MP-40 and using it without hesitation. Outside, Reeves abandoned his scoped position when enemy troops began lobbing grenades into the warehouse. He moved along the riverbank rubble, rifle slung now, revolver drawn for closer quarters. He encountered 2 German infantrymen attempting to flank through the debris. The first fell to a shot at near point-blank range. The second fled. Reeves did not pursue it. Pursuit was luxury. Survival was imperative. Back at the main defensive line, the Germans succeeded in breaching the ground floor of one building. For several minutes, combat became disjointed, individual fights in corridors lit only by intermittent muzzle flashes. McCrae coordinated as best he could, calling out positions, redirecting fire, ensuring no defender was isolated. Herrera, breath ragged, hurled their third grenade down a stairwell where German boots clattered upward. The explosion halted the advance but shook the entire structure, showering everyone in plaster dust. By 2300 hours, the attack faltered. German forces withdrew again, dragging their wounded into darkness. The flare light faded. Smoke reclaimed the bridge. The defenders did not cheer. They did not move unnecessarily. They simply reloaded what magazines they could refill and redistributed ammunition among the least supplied. Reeves returned to the main building shortly before midnight, his face streaked with soot and river mud. He reported increased movement along the southern embankment, suggesting another assault before dawn. McCrae nodded once. There would be no sleep. None expected it. Somewhere beyond the horizon, British armored columns were still fighting through roadblocks and ambushes, unaware of how thin the line at Arnhem had become. Inside the battered bridgehead, men counted grenades like coins at the bottom of a pocket. Herrera checked the last of their explosives, 2 grenades and a nearly spent magazine for the captured MP40. McCrae studied the bridge deck through a cracked window, memorizing its geometry in case fallback became necessary. Reeves cleaned his revolver with a strip of cloth torn from his sleeve. Around them, the Rhine flowed steadily, indifferent to banners or alliances. The night air carried the distant rumble of engines, but whether German reinforcements or Allied relief, no one could say. And so they waited again, 3 men among dozens, holding a bridge whose importance had become both strategic and symbolic. In the darkness before dawn, as fires smoldered and ammunition dwindled further, the defenders understood that the coming hours would not decide a battle alone. They would decide whether Market Garden endured as promised or dissolved into memory. Dawn at Arnhem did not break so much as bleed slowly into the smoke. The eastern horizon lightened in layers, gray first, then a faint ash blue that exposed the true condition of the bridgehead. Buildings that had seemed intact in darkness now stood peeled open like broken ribs. Brick facades hung outward. Staircases led to nothing. The steel of the bridge itself bore fresh scars, gouges where shell fragments had struck and ricocheted. The defenders looked older in the morning light, not from hours past, but from the knowledge that they had outlasted another night and were now fewer than before. McCrae stepped carefully over shattered glass and spent casings to assess positions. 3 more wounded. 1 dead, Private Hensley, who had held the western doorway until a burst from an MG-42 cut him down where he stood. They covered his body with a ground sheet. There was no ceremony, no time for it. Reeves had taken position again, this time higher, in the skeletal remains of a second-story room that offered a clear line along the northern approach. Through his scope, he could see German vehicles repositioning beyond the tree line. Light armor, half-tracks. The Germans were not preparing a mere infantry probe. They were preparing compression, tightening the noose. He relayed the observation without inflection. McCrae absorbed it and turned to Herrera. Charges. Herrera shook his head once. Enough to deny the span if we have to. Not enough to guarantee collapse. They understood what that meant. The bridge could be damaged, but perhaps not destroyed entirely. And even partial demolition would kill many of their own. Decisions like that were not tactical. They were terminal. At 6:12 the artillery resumed, heavier than before. German guns had adjusted through the night. Shells landed with greater precision, collapsing what remained of adjacent cover and turning rubble into shrapnel. The defenders flattened themselves against interior walls. Reeves remained prone, timing the interval between impacts to expose himself only in fractions of seconds. When German infantry advanced behind the barrage, he fired again, targeting squad leaders first, breaking the forward rhythm before it could form. Each shot was a subtraction from a larger equation. On the bridge deck, McCrae reorganized his men into smaller defensive cells. Large groups drew fire. Small ones survived. Herrera worked with mechanical calm despite the swelling in his wounded arm. He had repurposed broken furniture into firing rests and repositioned sandbags to reinforce a staircase choke point. Twice he stopped German soldiers who attempted to rush upward under covering fire. Twice he reloaded with fingers that trembled only after the magazine was seated. By mid-morning the Germans had brought a light armored car forward to test the bridge approach. Its engine growled beneath the steel arch as it inched closer, coaxial machine gun sweeping windows. Reeves adjusted his aim carefully. A direct hit on armor was impossible with his rifle, but the exposed commander's hatch offered a moment. When the hatch opened and a helmeted head emerged to assess resistance, Reeves fired. The officer slumped back inside. The vehicle reversed immediately, retreating out of the direct line of fire. It would return later with heavier support. It always did. Inside the building, water had nearly run out. Ammunition was redistributed again. One of the wounded muttered deliriously about hearing tanks that were not there. McCrae knelt beside him briefly, pressed a hand to his shoulder, then stood without promise. Outside, German loudspeakers began broadcasting surrender terms in accented English. Safe conduct, medical treatment, Humane captivity. The words floated across the river like a rehearsal of mercy. No one responded. Herrera muttered something in Spanish under his breath and checked the remaining grenades. One now. Just one. Reeves fired again, this time at a machine gun crew attempting to set up in a window opposite. The first gunner fell. The second dragged the weapon back. Smoke thickened. The defenders' world had shrunk to measured lines of sight and dwindling cartridges. Shortly after noon, German infantry made their most determined push yet, supported by mortar fire that walked systematically across the bridge span. Sections of railing were blown away. Splinters of steel screamed through the air. McRae's men fell back in stages, each group covering the other in disciplined withdrawal to preplanned interior positions. Herrera detonated one small charge to block a lower access route, collapsing debris into a narrow funnel that forced attackers into Reeves' sight line. It was not elegant. It was survival engineering at its purest. Reeves fired until his barrel heated and his cheek stung from recoil. German troops reached the outer wall. Hand grenades arced through shattered windows. One landed near McRae, who kicked it back toward the opening an instant before detonation. The blast deafened him for several seconds. When his hearing returned, it came as a dull roar. By 1400 hours, the defenders were compressed into the last viable building adjacent to the bridge. The Rhine glittered beyond, deceptively calm. No Allied armor appeared on the southern road. No relief banners. Only smoke columns rising from Arnhem itself. Reeves crawled down from his perch, ammunition nearly gone. "They're massing for one more," he said simply. Herrera nodded. He handed McRae the final grenade. "Last one," he said. The phrase hung heavier than the shelling. Around them, the remaining defenders adjusted positions, some binding wounds with strips torn from uniforms. There was no speech, no rallying cry, only the quiet knowledge that what remained would be decided not by numbers, but by minutes. When the final assault came, it was not chaotic. It was deliberate. German infantry advanced in coordinated waves, supported by concentrated machine gun fire that pinned every visible aperture. Smoke grenades rolled through the lower floor, forcing defenders upward into tighter confines. Reeves, now without a clear sniper vantage, fought with sidearms and borrowed rifles alike. Herrera fired until his captured weapon clicked empty, then picked up a fallen British rifle without pause. McRae directed movement through corridors reduced to dust and flame. The last grenade landed at 15:17 by his watch, thrown upward into the stairwell as German boots hammered closer. The explosion shattered the remaining banister and momentarily halted the ascent. It was the last controlled detonation within their power. After that, the fight dissolved into close, desperate exchanges in smoke-thick rooms where recognition came only by uniform silhouette. The bridge itself still stood, but the men who had held it were nearly out of means to do so. And yet, for hours longer than any planning document had predicted, they had denied a crossing to forces that believed the span already theirs. By late afternoon, the light had turned the color of old brass, filtered through smoke and pulverized brick dust that drifted like a second sky over Arnhem. What remained of the British perimeter around the bridge was no longer a defensive position in the formal sense. It was a cluster of rooms connected by broken walls, inhabited by men who understood that relief would not come in time to save them, only perhaps in time to learn from them. The last coherent report McRae managed to send through the field radio before its battery died was not dramatic. It contained grid references, estimated enemy strength, ammunition status, and a single measured sentence. Bridge not yet taken. It was the most important line of the day. That transmission, brief and clinical, traveled back across Allied lines and bought time. Time for units south of the river to adjust their axes of advance. Time for planners to understand the scale of resistance still anchored at Arnhem. What the message did not include was the cost. Inside the building that had once been a merchant's office overlooking the span, Reeves was down to 5 rounds. He rationed them not by distance, but by certainty. Each shot now had to matter absolutely. German infantry had learned his rhythm. They advanced cautiously, hugging shadows, using smoke and suppressive fire to mask movement. At one point Reeves held his breath for nearly a full minute, refusing to fire at a fleeting shape because he could not confirm rank or weapon. Ammunition was no longer for possibility. It was for inevitability. Herrera, pale from blood loss but steady in motion, shifted to structural denial. With no more charges to deploy, he used debris to create choke points. Overturned filing cabinets wedged into stairwells, collapsed beams dragged into doorframes to force attackers into single-file movement. He had not slept in nearly 2 days. His left sleeve was darkened with dried blood. When asked once if he could continue, he answered with the kind of understatement soldiers use when the alternative is unthinkable. Still moving. McCrae moved among them with a calm that bordered on abstraction. He had begun to think in terms of minutes rather than victory. Every 5 minutes the bridge remained contested, and 5 minutes later the German timetable slipped. He had seen the enemy's intent clearly now. This was no symbolic objective. The Arnhem Bridge was an artery, and arteries, once blocked, disrupt entire bodies. Shortly before 1700 hours, the Germans brought forward heavier support. An 88mm gun was positioned at an angle that allowed it to fire directly into the building's facade. The first shell tore through the second floor, collapsing Reeves' previous firing position entirely. The concussion stunned everyone inside. Plaster and brick rained down in sheets. The second impact cracked the remaining load-bearing wall. McCrae understood then that structural survival was measured in impacts, not hours. He ordered a contraction to the lowest viable level of the building. The bridge deck above echoed with movement, German troops testing for weakness. Reeves, now operating from ground level, fired his final confirmed shot at a machine gun crew attempting to anchor a suppressive position near the bridge arch. The round struck true. Then he lowered the rifle and passed it to a wounded private who still had 2 cartridges remaining. "Make them count," he said without ceremony. Smoke filled the lower corridor as the 88 fired again. This time the blast sheared off part of the exterior wall, exposing the defenders to direct fire. German infantry surged forward under covering bursts. Close quarters fighting resumed in spaces reduced to dust and splintered wood. Herrera used the butt of a rifle when ammunition failed. McCrae dragged a wounded corporal behind a collapsed beam and returned to the doorway with a pistol drawn. The soundscape narrowed to breath, impact, and the metallic cough of weapons fired too often in too short a span. Somewhere above, the bridge railing gave way under shellfire and fell into the river below. And yet, astonishingly, the Germans still had not secured uncontested passage. Every attempt to flood the span met resistance measured not in numbers but in defiance. At 1742, as dusk approached, a final coordinated German push forced entry into the lower room. The defenders, now fragmented and nearly out of ammunition, were overwhelmed not by surrender but by saturation. McCrae was struck in the shoulder and driven to the floor. Herrera collapsed near the base of the stairs, consciousness slipping. Reeves, disarmed and pinned beneath debris, could no longer reach a weapon. The fighting did not end with a dramatic gesture. It ended in exhaustion and encirclement. One by one, those still able to stand were ordered to drop their weapons. The German officer who entered the room did not shout. He surveyed the destruction in silence. The bridge still stood behind him, but it had cost far more time, men, and material than projected. The delay had forced reallocation elsewhere. It had slowed an advance meant to be surgical and swift. The defenders were taken prisoner in the fading light. Outside, the Rhine reflected the first colors of evening, indifferent to the outcome. What had been held for hours against overwhelming force would, by nightfall, fall into German control. But not on schedule, not cleanly, not without consequence. And in war, consequence is often the truest measure of success. The men who had held the Arnhem Bridge until the last grenade landed had not saved the operation. Market Garden would falter. The larger strategic gamble would fracture. But in those hours on that span, they had demonstrated something that no after-action report could fully quantify. That disciplined resistance, even in isolation, can distort the shape of a campaign. The bridge had not been theirs to keep. It had been theirs to deny. And they had denied it longer than anyone believed possible. They were marched off the bridge at dusk beneath the very structure they had refused to surrender. German medics worked efficiently among their own wounded first, then turned, without ceremony, to the prisoners. War at that stage had lost its theatrical qualities. It was inventory, exhaustion, and redistribution of men into categories: dead, wounded, captured, still fighting. Reeves walked with assistance, his left arm bound tightly against his ribs. Herrera drifted in and out of awareness, murmuring calculations about load-bearing angles as if the bridge were still a problem to be solved. McCrae, pale but upright, refused a stretcher until every surviving man under his command had been accounted for. It was a habit he would never break. The Arnhem Bridge, behind them, remained intact, but not untouched. The German advance across it resumed in stages, cautiously, as if uncertain whether resistance might reappear from the smoke. Engineers inspected structural damage before armor crossed. Infantry secured both ends again. Schedules had shifted. The day's timetable had dissolved into approximation. In headquarters farther east, staff officers redrew arrows on situation maps, recalculating fuel allocations and movement corridors. They would later record the delay in minutes. But delay in war is not measured only in time. It is measured in altered momentum. For the Allied command, the message that "bridge not yet taken" echoed long after the position itself had fallen. It revealed that the airborne units at Arnhem had not disintegrated immediately under pressure, as some feared. They were anchored. They had forced the enemy to commit resources disproportionate to the scale of the objective. And in that disproportion lay strategic effect. Market Garden would fail, its ambition exceeding its reach. But within that failure were isolated acts of endurance that reshaped local realities. Reeves spent the remainder of the war in captivity. His sniper rifle was catalogued and repurposed. German interrogators found little of value in him. He offered no embellishment, no bitterness, no confession beyond rank and serial number. In letters home after the war, he would describe Arnhem not as heroism but as a job finished when the tools ran out. It was the closest he would come to an explanation. Herrera recovered slowly from his wounds in a field hospital before being transferred to a prisoner camp in Germany. Years later, when asked why he had not detonated remaining charges prematurely to deny the bridge entirely, he answered with characteristic precision. Because the objective was delay, not destruction. Timing matters. His statement revealed what many had misunderstood. The bridge had not been meant to vanish in fire. It had been meant to resist occupation long enough to force a recalculation. McCrae did not survive captivity. Records indicate he succumbed to complications from his shoulder wound during a transfer in early 1945. There was no battlefield ceremony. His name entered the lists of missing, then confirmed dead. But the final transmission he sent, clinical, restrained, remained preserved in operational logs. It became a line quoted in regimental histories not for drama, but for clarity. The Arnhem Bridge itself would stand for decades after the war. Reconstructed where necessary, its scars gradually absorbed into civilian architecture. Commuters would cross it unaware that its span once carried the weight of a campaign's gamble. Children would cycle across it, pausing at railings that had once been firing positions. History has a habit of smoothing surfaces while leaving foundations intact. In strategic analysis, Arnhem is often cited as a cautionary tale, an example of overreach, of optimism untempered by intelligence. But within its narrative lie smaller arcs that resist categorization. A British sniper rationing certainty. 2 American engineers turning structural knowledge into tactical resistance. A handful of men understood that survival was secondary to disruption. They did not hold the bridge forever. That was never within their power. They held it until the last grenade landed, until ammunition thinned into inevitability, until structure itself began to fail. In doing so, they transformed an operational objective into a contested memory. One that persists not because it altered the war's outcome, but because it altered its texture. War is often recorded in advances and retreats, in arrows that move across maps with clinical simplicity. But bridges are not arrows. They are intersections. At Arnhem, for a span of hours, the intersection became resistant. And resistance became delayed. And delay, though rarely celebrated, is sometimes the only victory available. When historians revisit the Battle of Arnhem, they will speak of coordination breakdowns, intelligence gaps, weather conditions, and armored reinforcements that arrived too soon. They will calculate probabilities and cite tonnage. Yet beneath those calculations remains a quieter truth, that on a bridge over the Rhine, 3 men and a scattering of exhausted soldiers understood their role precisely. Not to win, not to survive, but to hold long enough for history to feel the friction of their refusal. The bridge still stands. The men who held it are gone, but the measure of their stand was never permanence. It was the duration, and duration in war can reshape even the most carefully drawn plan.